Hey, fellow G and Tears, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. This is going to be a funny intro because Daniel and I were just talking about the first times we got high, but that's not what this episode's about.
No, but it happened. It definitely happened.
That definitely happened in our
Yeah.
teenage years. All right, so we're back for another action-packed episode of Gin and Tantra.
Yeah.
We're trying to talk about Karma Mudra, but who knows where this is going to go because we had some episodes where all kinds of feels came up in different ways.
Yeah.
But our idea is to talk about Karma Mudra, which is the use of relationship, sexuality, love for spiritual development, right?
Yeah.
And we're kind of walking through kind of basic questions. Dr. Nita in his book on Karma Mudra does a good job of just laying out like fundamental questions people might have. And so we're using that as sort of like a conversation starter. And
And
we got to the one, yep.
the book is by Dr. Nita. It's Karma Mudra, the Yoga of Bliss.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I know we talk about it in the episodes, but I just want to put that out in the beginning.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm kind of like chipping away at it
Yeah,
in
yeah,
different
as am I.
ways to get things. Eventually, we're going to talk about the whole idea of the subtle channels and the Vajra body there. And I think he says some interesting things about that. So
Yeah.
more to come, G and Tears. But okay, so we got to the part where we got to one of Daniel and I's favorite subjects. I don't know, but subject
Eric,
that
Eric,
usually is
before
one. Yeah,
before you go there, there's this is a favor and as a reminder, there's a good number of people who watch us on a pretty regular basis who are not subscribed. So if you're consuming our content, I just ask that you subscribe to the channels because it helps our visibility, helps us get on other guests and things like this. So it's helpful to us. So if you would do that right now, that'd be great.
yeah. Hit the button, as they say, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Smash the
Smash that.
button.
Smash it.
Yeah, the big pitch at the beginning.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
I was wondering if I should start doing that. But you usually are the person who does the pitch, so I'm glad that you did it.
Well,
So
I wait to
thanks.
the end usually, but
Yeah,
whatever.
I say it like 12 times during the thing,
Yeah,
right?
pretty
Just to
much. Yeah,
remind
yeah.
folks.
But I don't want to be annoying, but I want to be assertive. So there's a middle line in there somewhere that I'm working on in my life, and I'll figure it out hopefully before I die.
Yep, 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 yep. There's some political commentary in that, but we're going to leave that alone
We
because
will
we don't
leave it
want to go
alone.
down that. We don't want to go down that well.
No, no.
Things are, yeah. So,
Yep.
okay, so we're funner subject matters. Karma Mudra, sex, love, relationship, spirituality. That's what this is about.
Yeah.
So he gets the part where he asks this question of, patriarchy and
Yeah.
what's the relationship between Karma Mudra and patriarchy. So I don't know. We both have our ideas. I kind of jotted down some of mine.
Sure.
Maybe I'll get the ball rolling, but I know you have feelings about this one too. So, okay. So for me, the thing that popped out for me first is the thing to bring up, and I'm going to use this as my little prop here. I'll hold it up to the camera. This is one of
Mm-hmm.
my little favorite books on this thing,
It's awesome.
Passionate Enlightenment. And this is one of the first things I actually read about this subject matter way back in the day. So it's women in Tantric Buddhism, but she just does a very good job. The author's Miranda Shaw.
Mm.
I did reach out to her to come on to the show, but she doesn't seem like she has much of a social media presence at all. So you really can't find her.
Mm.
So I haven't had much luck, but she's kind of a really interesting person. Um, I first stumbled across her in like an old magazine they used to have back in the day, What is Enlightenment? And so her stuff was kind of featured there on an issue of the magazine they did on sexuality and spirituality overall. So I was like, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stumbled across this book, and she was kind of like an academic person, but she was kind of trying to bridge that gap between academic stuff and genuine spiritual stuff, just not being just an academic, but also being someone who wanted to be a practitioner and wanted to
Yeah.
go deeper in things. And there are a number of people like that. I'm going to reach out to another lady who I think will hopefully we'll have her on, and I'll save that for when we get further. But we're trying to reach out to different voices within this subject matter. So that's the plan for upcoming episodes. We're talking about Karma Mudra, and we'll talk with people about it. But anyways, the book was pretty influential for me, so I can recommend it to folks.
Yeah.
And also, she makes a big argument in terms of the patriarchy thing, which is that there's a sort of a stereotype of patriarchy. That's not to deny that there aren't patriarchies within these cultures that we're talking about.
Yeah.
They have issues.
Yeah.
So I don't want to get to the thing where we're idealizing them. We try not to do that either, right?
Correct.
And even some of the people we love, like I love Robert Thurman, we love Bobby T, but sometimes he idealizes on some level. We can be honest, right?
Yeah. I mean,
A little bit. He
I think
emphasizes the positive, right?
Yeah, that was just going to say he's emphasizing the positive, and I think anytime that you are passionate about something or that you believe in something or something has been very kind of influential on your life for a really long time, you are going to see the more positive, the brighter sides of that particular thing because that's what you're interacting with. But I think for us, we're intentionally trying to highlight the positives, but then also, as the kids say, keep it a buck.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one before.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh. Is that a Gen Z thing or is that a
I don't
millennial
know.
thing?
No, you know what are generations anymore? You know what I mean? It's just you and me
That kind of
and other
exists.
people.
Yeah.
No, but we want to keep it real in terms of saying, well, there is everything in manifest form has a light and a dark side. Full stop. Right? Our Mary Kayism in this scenario. And so we have, regardless of what that is, it's important to understand some of the potential pitfalls that are out there so that you can avoid them, but learn from them. Because if we're taking life as the guru, you're taking life as your teacher, then and some of the potential obstacles that are there, then you can go right to them and say, what can I learn from these things, in order to avoid them, but more importantly, to take things from them, because you're already going to take things from the positive stuff anyways, because it's not easy, but you're going to flow with it. And the areas where you're going to have some stagnation or some difficulties, I mean, there's a lot more there to pull from. So, anyways,
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, we don't want to do some like Skibbity Ohio kind of a thing. That's Gen Z slang.
yeah, 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 we're not into
And
that.
we love Bobby T. He's the Rizzler man. He's Mr. Sigma.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. He's a
Yeah.
Risley bear.
So we're not in any way hating on him. I
No,
love Robert Thurman.
yeah,
But we are trying to like, because if you like for what we're trying to do, if we don't acknowledge those things, then it loses a certain amount
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah, for
authenticity, and
sure.
we want to keep it as real as possible.
Hmm.
So okay, so anyways, it's not like that, but she again, going back to Miranda Shaw, who, but her point is something like, if you really go back and you look at this, and she's trying to challenge like even other academics in this book, or people who have that pedigree behind them. She's throwing out a challenge, which is that if you really look at this, these relationships were much more equal between the partners involved in it, and in a certain
The Karma
sense,
Muja partnerships, you mean?
Karma Muja
Okay,
partnerships.
okay.
They were much more equal relationships. And in many situations, it was the female partner. We're talking about heterosexual relationships for the
Yeah, yeah,
most
yeah,
part in literature. Doesn't have to be, but that's what we're talking about
yeah.
here. Those women were the teachers, right? And part of the argument would be that it sort of had to be that way because if these are sincere people, you're getting something where they both have to have the necessary qualities, the necessary skills, the necessary insights. That's not a sexuality thing even. That's just like we have to be both passionate to be enlightened for this book's title, right?
Right.
We have to be pursuing that. And you need two people who are in that headspace and two people
Yes.
who feel that same level of dedication
Yes.
and really want to work on themselves and want to like connect with another person in that way. So, that's how it is. And she does a good job. And maybe we'll do a separate thing. There's a number of these little books I'll hold up to the camera that are just kind of interesting about this.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll do a whole separate one on some of her stuff. Like she has one of the yoginis who I'm really like, I love the little bits of poetry that she does that she has in this book. I'll
Mm.
mention her a little bit later on. But anyways, to be more covered maybe about this particular thing, but that's her big argument, and
Yeah.
she tries to go through and really show, and I'll give a list later on of some of the names, but like a lot of these great female teachers, either in India or in Tibet, and so that's the position. I did another kind of interesting thing with this prop number 2, Tantric
Mhm.
Quest from Daniel Odier. So again, maybe something to be done as a sort of a separate episode up the road. So just a
What's
little
that one called again?
little sampler. It's called Tantric Quest.
Okay.
He's an interesting guy, and I had a like, just as far as like the scheduling goes, Monday night, which would have been last night, was the special day on the monthly calendar for the Buddhist goddesses. So I was thinking about this episode. I was doing my special meditations for the day of the month. I do my Buddhist goddess day meditations, the
Yeah.
wisdom goddesses. There's a thing that you can kind of like self-empower, they call it. If you've had a tantric initiation, you reinitiate yourself if you've done a retreat on it. So I do that a couple times a month, just for people who'd be interested in the practice aspects of this. But I like was thinking about our episode, and I pulled this book off the shelf, and there's a number of things I like to talk about in it. But the backstory is he's a kind of a French guy, and he was really interested in Asian culture and philosophy, especially India, especially like the um, the Shivite ones, Kashmir Shaivism, right?
Hmm.
Things around Shiva. And then he traveled also, he studied with some Tibetan Buddhists, and he did some different things. I didn't know his whole backstory totally, but I'm learning about him more in the last couple of days. And then he traveled to India and he met this female teacher. And, they had like this very intense relationship of teacher student, and she was the teacher, right? And his point, so I searched out, I found an interview with him actually in between my meditation sessions last night. I was up late night on Buddhist Goddess Day. And yeah, he was basically saying, yeah, that's the tradition, that it was a lot of females who were the more dominant part of the lineage. And he makes this kind of argument that you get about Indian culture that it goes back to like the older Indian culture, thousands of years ago, right, where it was still a little bit more matriarchal, and those lines
Yeah.
still continued
Yeah.
even after the rest of the culture shifted. You still got these lineages still going through. So
Mm,
that's kind of his position on this too. And
mm,
but you can take whatever attitude you want about that. Some people believe in that, some people don't, whatever. But the thing is, still happening. And this was sort of in this dude's actual life,
yeah.
So I was listening to him talk about it just on Monday. So another kind of, I just wanted to show a couple of things where this question gets brought up, and you want equality between the partners. You certainly don't want to be, a patriarchal thing between those two people. And so what can you say about this in the end? Yeah, to my mind, I would say, okay, all these little things I think deserve their separate episodes because these are good books and good, interesting people to talk about.
Yeah.
But to me, the take-home message is something like, was this a perfect thing? No. But is there a truth in the fact that there was more equality or women who were teachers? That seems to be true too. And for us in the now, trying to do these things in the now, we can do this in a way with that attitude, with that as our underlying philosophy. Let's make these things equal between people, right? And that's going to be the healing way to approach it.
Mm.
So I know you got stuff on this you want to say?
Yeah, I guess I'll reflect some of Dr. Nita's points in his book, which were that like that this practice has the potential to be an opportunity for people to take advantage of others, and specifically he was referencing male teachers and female students, right? So
Mhm.
we wanted to, I mean, that's kind of like, there's innuendo with what you're talking about as the opposite, but that I think more in line with maybe Western ideas of teachers. There's probably the male sitting at the front, you know, preaching or teaching, and then taking advantage of, potentially, not always, but potentially taking advantage of his students. And so this is what you're bringing up is the kind of opposite effect. And this goes back again to our episodes that we did, man, like I don't know, dude, a year and a half ago,
Mhm.
on our kind of femininity episodes when we had Joni Osborne on, and we were going over that book, if God was a woman. And
Mhm.
this was one of her, or at least when I was going over that book, because I read that for the prep for those episodes, that like she had brought that point up, that specific thing, that the female in a more matriarchal society, or she used the term egalitarian, but not so much like a hierarchy, but more of like a kind of a communal based living tribal type, with a group of elders or whatever that was in charge, as a more, again, a feminine, dominant place, because women were viewed as the givers of life because they didn't understand, how life came to be. And even if you understand how life comes to be, that it shouldn't be any less. It shouldn't be any
Yeah, I don't even
less
know
of
if
a
there's
miracle.
a misunderstanding how life comes to be. That's kind of an interesting question. I don't know if it's that so much, but is that what she was saying?
Yeah, that's in part what she was saying, because
Oh,
they
interesting. Okay.
because it
Okay.
seemed that, like, of course you have sex, but then it was the woman who birthed life, who created life, who made, whatever.
Mhm.
And again, according to her, that the men were kind of useful tools, you
That's
know.
interesting take. Okay. So anyways, yeah,
Right, but so
we
but
can,
it was
yeah, there's
this.
stuff to talk about with that, but that's not the main point. So yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but the
Mhm.
but the point is that the women had a stronger stance in society than, even much more than now. You know what I'm saying? And that this was a different place. And so, to I guess to hear it, I just want to like say it is a different, it's kind of a mind switch to think that like there would be um tantric teachers, sexual yoga teachers, who would take on a partner in this way. Students, I don't know how it would work. I don't know if you have many students, or so. I mean, I'm assuming you have to build a bond with people. You can't just like, I don't know, hop
But
in.
this, Daniel Odier was talking about the idea, like it was pretty intense. Like they spent a lot of time together,
That
and
would
it
be my
seemed like it
guess.
was a very intense relationship. Yeah, beyond anything that had to do with sexuality, it was just like she was going to train him,
Yeah.
and it was very, very intense. And listening to him describe it, because I just happened to hear him talk about it yesterday night, he was basically saying, like, She did a lot of things to sort of keep him off balance too. So sometimes she'd wake him up in the middle of the night and say, "Hey, we're doing a spiritual training session now, not sexual one, but
Right.
just like, hey, chop chop, we're doing this." And sometimes she'd go 20 hours, like forcing him to do these meditations and difficult things. Like, so
Yeah.
she was pretty demanding on
Yeah.
him,
Yeah. Yeah.
which I was like, okay, cool. I did Zen stuff. I can understand that. She
Yeah.
was pushing him, trying to get him to grow and develop. But yeah, in that case, as far as the time and the commitment and the involvement from a
Mhm.
teacher student thing in that context,
Yeah.
it was, pretty intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. So it isn't an easy question. I mean, realistically, yeah, there's certainly we can't, as a honest actors trying to share things, we can't say there hasn't been abuse or potential for
For
abuse. That
sure.
wouldn't be right,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And I have to say, some of the things, do look kind of negative to it, would look kind of negative to us now. There's a kind of a thing, we haven't done separate episodes on it, of what they call crazy wisdom. Dr. Nita brings up that in his book as well, right?
Yeah.
Which is sort of like, and I think the idea has a lot of good to it, that you have to challenge the things around you. More on that to come in this episode, right? As a way of producing wisdom, you challenge the expectations and how people think things should be. But some of that stuff, even when I read that literature as a person who's open to that, you're like, well, that doesn't feel right now. Some of that stuff, when you read these older texts, they read kind of weird, you know,
Mhm.
where you're like, well, that doesn't seem like, okay, I guess that could be considered as crazy wisdom, but that just seems like over the top behavior that doesn't seem good. And that's also kind of like, we're not going to talk about too much, but that's kind of like the Trungpa Rinpoche part two, where people have questions about him. But anyway, so that stuff is real. But I think Miranda Shaw's point is, like, if you look through the whole tradition overall, there is an egalitarian streak in it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
we would want to represent the egalitarian streak in it, right?
Hmm.
And like, so that would be sort of the idea. Okay, so let me throw out some of the names of some of the great female teachers just for the hay of it, and maybe people will end up talking about in the future. So Yeshi Sogal is associated as being the partner of Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava. So maybe an episode to be done. I have a great tanka, like one of those Buddhist paintings of one of the really great figures, Machikalabdram. Um, uh, the great poetess I was talking about was Sahaja Yogini Chinta. Uh, Actually, this Daniel Odier, the French guy I was talking about, specifically
Yeah.
talked about Naguma. So there's all these great people.
Mhm.
And these names don't mean much to people who are listening to these episodes now.
Correct.
I think they deserve separate episodes later. But the point is, like, these are really famous people. It would be like, I don't know what the equivalent would be, because they don't even have great teachers in the Western tradition. But it would be a saying
No.
like Saint Paul or something, like you'd be like, oh, that's an important person,
Hmm.
or whoever the names would be, Rumi. This would be that the equivalent
Yeah.
level of that person, of that level of import and that level of importance. So, but the other thing that hit me in this with the patriarchy thing, and would be that there is a big emphasis, though, on women kind of breaking out of systems of control. So
Mm.
that's another theme that seems to come up in these stories related back to this whole idea of, like, what is patriarchy, right? And I had a really interesting conversation with somebody I know about this, because we were talking about this whole issue of what does it mean to establish yourself as kind of like a tantric person, and to what extent you have to, like, break through things and establish your own identity, kind of individuate yourself, right? If you want to
Mm-hmm.
use some Jungian language. And I got curious as to who are the female voices if you go back to these older tantric stories. How many female voices do you got? So I pulled off one last thing, which is this Masters of Mahamudra. Mahamudra being sort of the deepest meditation traditions, the deepest meditation approaches, and also these Mahasiddhas, the people who are sort of like these powerful kind of historical yogic figures with all these amazing backstories, right? So I thought maybe just for a second I do, like, we haven't done it in a bit, like a little G&T story time break,
Mm.
where I'll tell the tale of a couple of these ladies, because I got interested in looking at it. The question became something like, like, do you have to, like, break out of patriarchy? Do you have to break out of things in order to get yourself spiritually moving forward? But I
Mm.
think that's another question of patriarchy too. To what extent do you have to challenge it and, like, pop out and transcend it? So I was just looked it up, and I was like, like, are there any females amongst these very famous 84 Mahasiddhas. This is
Mhm.
kind of a famous thing, legends of the Mahasiddhas and these great tantric Buddhist yogis and yoginis, because there are yoginis. Now, in a weird way, I looked it up and there were only four of
Oh,
the 84, but there were at least four, right? Which you could go in other places of the world and get none. So I was like, okay, at least there's four here, right? And then some of the other 80 of these figures who are dudes, they do have female teachers and things. So, okay, but maybe aren't the prominent characters in the stories. As far as G&T story time goes, what I thought was interesting about it was like, I look at these kinds of things as being teaching tales. You know what I mean? Did they happen? Who knows? Right? But the tradition has sort of preserved them, and now they become sort of a teaching tale that we can try to relate to now and see what we get out of those things. And I don't know how you feel about this, Daniel, but I feel the same way about, even like a Rumi thing. He comes up a lot in our episodes. Like it's kind of like a teaching tale in a way, though maybe that story happened,
yeah.
more recently in history. There's more factual veracity behind it or something, but maybe it doesn't matter one way or the other. I look at them as teaching things, and the tales have their morals behind them. So is that the way you think about that too, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, I mean, any story that survives uh, time in order to be told and retold again has value. What that value is, I think, is going to depend on the individual. But if it survives, that there's probably a reason it survives, especially the length of time that these stories have survived and the amount of people who are engaged in them. So I think I'm thinking of like maybe Bible-esque type stories, which are um, and I use this word lovingly, regurgitated.
Ah.
Ah,
But like from like a baby, from a mommy to a baby bird, that kind of regurgitation.
yes,
Hmm.
yes. Acknowledging the deep suffering of conditioning that goes along with this regurgitation. And I mean that in a negative sense. No.
Yes.
And if
Mhm.
that bothers you, then go drink some water, you know?
There's a little something toxic in that regurgitation.
Ah,
Yeah, there
yes,
was a
there
little,
is. There's a little bit of bile in there.
yeah,
It comes up, you know?
yeah.
Um, but so some of those I think are structured in the way in order to kind of like habituate some people. But given that these stories were not just passed forth from a different part of the world, and Bible stories were too also, but these are often older and then translated into English to a much smaller audience. That there is some other kind of power in them, that somebody had to have a passion in order to do this, and they're not making a
Mm,
lot of money. They're not, it's not in it. And I get Bible stories can also be the same thing, but there's so many stories of so many yogis, of so many different traditions, that were passed forward. Again, that didn't have to be translated into English. There has to be, well, it doesn't have to be, it might, but for me, there is something from them. And regardless of the story, from whichever um, side of religiosity or spirituality that it comes from, are designed to pass forth something of value. Now, that something of value is going to be interpreted by by the interpreter, by the person who's hearing it, and therefore trying to use that into their life. So all of these stories are passed forth in order to make a change in the person or teach them a particular kind of a lesson. And I think that like there is value in them because they sort of transcend modernity,
mm.
in a way that they will be able to maintain their momentum so long as people keep talking about them, because they can't really be brushed off in the same way that you could by someone saying, oh, this happened and that happened. And then because then you move more into the realm of logic and the Enlightenment era, where people have to put things into boxes, and then you can wipe off someone's deep story about their life where they learned something and they want to tell you about it as anecdotal, right? Oh, that's anecdotal. So I don't need that evidence because it's
Oh,
not.
I see what you mean.
Do you
Yeah,
know
it
what I'm
doesn't, it's
saying?
not like a statistical study. It's just an anecdotal story that doesn't carry the
Yes,
same
yes.
weight behind it then.
Whereas these stories, which are often, told in a style of like a parable, often are sometimes riddles or sometimes, put in different ways that transcend logic. And if you can do that, then you have to use a different part of your mind to understand and extrapolate pieces from those stories. And then therefore, you can't. clearly categorize what it is that it's trying to teach you because it's deeper, you know?
Mhm.
And if you're willing to digest it and engage with it, it will offer you more than just the tale on the superficial level. You will begin to realize that the energy and the intention and the teachings go beyond simply the words that are being expressed. There's a meaning
Mhm.
behind it. There's a dance behind it. The teachings are tantra. It is not what you do, but how you do it. And so it is in the telling of the story as it is the story itself.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit of a flashback to some of our like kind of Joseph Campbell conversations from some
Yeah.
years back, where like, why do you have a tale? Why do you have a story like I'm gonna look at four of these, right? And they're partially like they're teaching devices, right?
Mm-hmm.
As much as they are anything else. Yeah. And then the other part that hit me about this as I was thinking about this, maybe it's because we're clinicians in a certain sense. I can't say they're case studies exactly, but they're trying to illustrate case study principles,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's weird because even in the episodes we do, like we did episodes on Carl Jung, and for the purpose of our little podcast, he was a case study for us. He was like a person that you watch him trying to develop himself. And then his life is as much a Mahamudra story as like any of these Mahamudra stories for the purpose of what we're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're trying to extract those things that have psychospiritual value out of this dude's life. Now we know he was an actual person, and the tale is much more one that we can all kind of look at, but we can look at even his life. At least I realized I was doing that. Now,
Yeah.
so I'm just being honest about that. I think that's something that maybe because, we're clinical minded people,
Yeah.
you can kind of approach it that way. So I kind of look for, okay, so what's the moral of like Carl Jung's life?
Yeah.
What are the morals? What are the lessons we can learn from Rumi's life? Or what are
Yeah.
the morals or lessons we can learn from these little tales, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I went in like kind of not knowing what they were going to be, but like what I got in the end was like it's four stories of these four different women, and they all pop out some way or another. So every tale has this same theme of like they're going to get kind of like enmeshed in what you call patriarchy or what you can call whatever you want to call it. They're going to get enmeshed, and in
Yeah.
some moment in the tale, they surge out. And what was so interesting about them to me was they're still very real, like to the now, to me on some, like it's still very much like the same issues that gets presented with every person.
Yeah.
So I'll give a couple, right? I got two of them are kind of tied together. So G&T story time.
Ah.
I'll tell us a few tales. So I got curious because it was like, okay, how is it for people? What do they have to do? What are these stories saying we have to do to psycho spiritually surge ourselves forward? So of these four ladies, one of the things you see in all of them is they all break with control and convention. They
Mm.
all do this, and there's some moment where they have to do it. And so the stories are very interesting then. So the one that you can kind of tell together, two of the four are kind of like entwined because it's kind of these two sisters, and they both are married, you know. Now this would have been, an older time Indian thing. So during these marriages, they're married, I think, both to people who are in the boating industry or something. But what was so interesting about it was at a certain point in the story, it says they just get tired because they're arguing with their husbands, right? And so it's arguing, arguing, arguing. And then it just says in the story, and then around the people around them, the people are all just gossipy and kind of shallow and petty. And that's the story. And I
Huh.
had thought, yeah, that's pretty much like a lot of human life, like
Mm-hmm.
right there. It hasn't changed that much at all. Same issues are facing these ladies as we could imagine facing lots of people, clashing of personalities, arguing, gossiping neighbors, shallowness, these kinds of things. And so at some point, they just break out and they meet someone who's in the story, kind of a very famous kind of tantric practitioner, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he gives them this empowerment, and they go on to become these enlightened figures. But there's this thing where, call it patriarchy, call it whatever you want, they pop out, right? Um, there's a little bit of like funny linguistic trivia in it. They're called the severed headed sisters, and you're like, well, what's that about? And we'll talk about these things maybe later on. But they have in India these kind of severed headed goddess figures where
Mm.
they'll like cut the goddess will like have her own head cut off, and all of this surging of her own blood will be flowing out to all these different characters who will have these like sometimes skull
Skull
cups or
cups.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, where they're capturing sort of the vitality and essence of this goddess, you know?
Hmm.
So if you don't know that tradition, you'll be like, what are they talking about?
Hmm. Hmm.
But Chinnamostra is one of the big divinities around this, and she's part of this group of goddesses they call the Mahavidyas, to be covered in some of the later episode around all this tantric stuff. But so that's where the story comes from. So they're kind of related back to this. They kind of like are related back to this tradition of meditation on the goddess whose life-giving resources are flowing out to everyone, right?
And we could, to just to touch on it, like the reason for which she has removed her head is that, at least in my understanding, she has overcome the external senses of the human body, right?
Yeah.
And that it is
That,
she is no longer bound to the mundane sight, mundane hearing, mundane thinking, mundane smelling, mundane tasting, mundane feeling, even mundane life, in such a way that she can remove her head, and what comes out is life giving, is transformative, is, like you said, is the sort of immortality elixir, if you will.
yeah, the enlightenment elixir comes like flowing right into your,
Yes.
the Amrita,
Yeah,
right?
the Amrit. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
so when if people, for people who are interested in this kinds of things, you'll see some images that are, they look out of place in comparison to like art that comes from the Enlightenment period, or the Renaissance, which is all very kind of like humanistic, beautiful bodies, sort of, very chiseled, very clean and clear, and you could see this angelic, kind of. I'm thinking of artwork that's in Italy,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's very famous.
Renaissance people, the Michelangelo types. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that defines almost kind of like what people think is like fine art, and some different stuff, Picasso, whatever. But this is kind of where people think about artwork. But then when you compare it to like these East Asian traditions, it's very different. The gods and goddesses, I don't want to call them gods and goddesses, we'll say deities, look very different because their eyes are bugging out of their head. They're holding weapons. They're drinking out of cups that are full, skull, human skulls, with blood overflowing with them. They're standing on top of dead bodies, um, and it looks very like, to the Western mind, it's like, whoa, what is this? How is this spiritual? This looks terrible. They live in the funeral pyre of like the dead people. They wear dead people's clothing. the the food that and the flowers that the family leave, they take it and they use it for themselves. They cover themselves in dead people's ashes. Like, this doesn't make any sense. How is this angelic? How is this closer to divinity? How is this in any way, shape, or form closer to spirit? I'm just because it doesn't make a lot of sense when compared with a sort of like
I mean, I
pristine
get what you're saying. If
presence.
not used to this imagery, you're like, what is
Like,
this?
what the
You can
fuck?
really be. So if someone was listening and you weren't familiar with this at all, we might have people who are like that. You're like, oh,
Yeah,
I'll check this out. And you're like,
yeah,
whoa, there's this goddess and her head is surging blood everywhere. Like,
yeah,
what is happening?
yeah.
Or like
And
the Kali imagery and so on. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, but all of it's all symbolic.
Mhm.
Everything is symbolic, and so it's representing the transcending of, as I mentioned before, as the transcending the mundane, transcending the things that we are normally attached to, that we how we view and experience life with. These beings are depicted as divine beings because they have transcended them, and so now they dance on the senses. They don't need to have the same kind of interaction with the reality that we have, because they have a different interaction with a deeper sense of reality that moves beyond the kind of mundane appearances that we are normally used to being engaged with. Therefore, they are depicted because they have done that. And this is the depiction of their transcendent state. It's the best way that they found out how to put that
And
in.
then like the kind of the stories of these two sisters, then that symbolizes that they become the goddess.
Yes.
I am the goddess now. See, I can
Boom.
like sever my head and put it back,
Yeah.
or whatever. It's did that happen? No, but like it's a symbolic part of the story that shows the transcendence of these two figures, right?
Mm-hmm.
And their spiritual path, right? some of the stuff that you're talking about too, which, we don't know where we're going to go in these conversations. We throw things out and we just kind of like vibe off of each other with this. But some of that has to do with pure and impure, like overcoming dualities, right?
Yes.
So if I'm in the charnel ground, oh, this is supposed to be a bad, impure place, but I'm going to prove to you that this is no less pure than, the Brahmin temple, or this is no less pure than Vatican City. I'll show you that
Yeah.
the fundamental ground of reality, it's all pure, right?
Hmm.
And so, it's a big tantric theme, right? So sometimes some of that imagery that seems shocking is purposely kind of there to go, okay, we're going to push you beyond mundane appearances, what you could like typically think, right? And
Hmm.
we'll also push you into this place where the thing that you think is impure, the thing that you think is, the bad thing. No, that's not the bad thing. It's not,
Hmm.
this funeral ground's just as pure as any place else, right?
Hmm.
And they have
Hmm.
their own cultural ways of showing it, but like, yeah, that's it. So then you can extract kind of the meaning of the story out of that, right?
Hmm.
Okay, story time number two. So this is I am really interested in this particular figure. I'm interested in all of these, but this Lakshman Kara is really interesting. She ends up being the founder of a tradition that I feel a lot of love for, but I actually didn't know that she was the founder of this thing.
Who is it?
It's Lakshman Kara, so it's not like we wouldn't know her. I mean, even in our little special circles, it's not a name that. I mean, there's a whole chapter of on her in this little book.
Passionate.
But yeah, passionate enlightenment for people who are listening. But it's not like one of the names that immediately pops out, even if you're familiar with Buddhist Tantra. But the story is fantastic. So, and it shows the same kind of thing, this kind of, I think, need for transcendence or something, right? This need for transcendence. So in her tale, she is sent off to be married by her brother. She's from like royalty. And she goes to wherever the neighboring kingdom is, to get to meet her betrothed, and she sees him coming back in from the hunt, and she's just like, "Oh no, oh no, I'm not marrying this guy. No, no way, I'm not doing this." And so she has these reactions to him, and I mean, who knows what he actually looked like? It's kind of interesting, if you try to personalize it, he might just look like kind of a douche coming in. And she's like, "No, I'm not doing this." But at a deeper level, you get the idea also like her saying something like, "No, I'm going Joseph Campbell on this a little bit," right? The mythology expert. You really get the feeling like, "No, I'm not throwing my life away on this. No way, I'm not doing that." And her response is really like a great tale, because what she does is she like fakes insanity. She pretends to be insane. So she's like rips off all of her clothes and she covers herself on all of this sort of like gross stuff, and she locks herself in the room and no one can get her out. So she's completely doing this thing of like, no, I'm not going to do this. She just completely like does this as, I guess, a kind of a protest, but even like a technique, like I'm going to make myself unwettable.
Mm.
And I'm not going to do this. The answer is no. And then the tale continues. She eventually escapes out of the the royal palace place. She goes out into the world and she continues to pursue her enlightenment, which she gets, right? Um, and so the thing that she found is something I want. Again, this is another one where there's like lots of little things where I thought, oh, that's an episode too that we're going to do in the future. But she found this lineage that's sometimes called Sahajayana, related back to this idea of something called Sahaja, which is like the innate purity of things or something. So it's another one of these ones where this purity thing comes up, the pure ground of like being or something. So she becomes part of this lineage, and that deserves another conversation. But that's tale number three, right? What struck me about though, Daniel, was this idea like it's another character, and they're all like this, where they're like, okay, I'm being presented with whatever you want to call it, patriarchy or mundaneness or something, and no, I'm popping out, right? And like, it happens in almost every story. So you got more on this one before I tell the last one?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so the last one is this character named Mahibhadra, the final example. And it's another one where she's also engaged to be married and doesn't want to do it, right? But she has an encounter with a traveling tantrika. This is not as well of a known person, at least I didn't recognize the name initially. But they're talking and they strike up a conversation kind of almost about the meaning of life. Because she asks him, "What are you doing? And why aren't you off like kind of doing the normal things of life?" And he says, "Well, no, I'm a yogi and I'm trying to go through and this is my opportunity, this is my human life, and I want to take the best advantage of it as I can, and I don't want to waste it. And so, no, that would be a waste of my thing. And so I'm going out to do this other stuff. And she's like, oh, that sounds really good. As often happens in these stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Probably would call this a karmically fortuitous meeting, but she's really struck by this. And so then he goes and he sees like, oh, she really has a feeling for this. So she gives him the enlightenment into this. He gives her the initiation into this thing called the Wheel of Bliss, which is a real common kind of Buddhist Tantra, the Chakrasamvara. And so she goes back to her family, and they're like, no way. And so they kind of force her still to go into this life, that was sort of prearranged for her, right? And and it's really interesting because, all of a sudden now she's living kind of much more of a normie life for that
Yeah.
time, and
Yeah.
probably a normie life for this time too. She's like kind of like a stay-at-home mom, right? And they say that it's described really interesting. She's described as like controlling her body and speech by presenting this outward compliance and niceness. So she's doing this for this extended period of time. And so I'm reading this thing, I'm like, okay, interesting. That's probably what human life is generally like, right? Even
Mm-hmm.
down to the present day, you know? And so she's going through this. And I was thinking, okay, is that even talking about repression or something? What is this saying? But the story comes to its capper. She's going down to get some water from the river, and she's carrying this vase, this vessel to carry the water back. And she has the water, and the vase slips out of her hand, and it crashes crashes to the earth, and it breaks, right? And all the water goes around. And then the psych part of this was interesting to me because she goes completely catatonic, and she's just there staring at this vase. And it's the story says that her husband comes, and other people from the family come, and other people and neighbors come, and they're trying to snap her out of this, but she won't snap out. Um, until eventually, like it's getting towards the evening time, the time of the goddesses, and then she pops out. And I'll just share the verse because I have it kind of marked in this little book, right? She pops out and she recites this verse, which is really kind of capturing of things. She says, sentient beings from beginningless time break their vessels, their lives ended. Why do they return home? Today I've broken my vessel, but abandoning my samsara home, I go on to pure pleasure. Verse. And then in the story, she goes kind of like flying up in the sky,
I love when they do that.
symbolizing her enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got like a great painting, of like it's like from the Art Institute of Chicago, and it shows this female figure flying up into the sky, and she's kind of like on the ground. There's sort of like a clothesline, and there's clothes hanging there. It's like kind of like flittering in the breeze, and it shows this character flying up to the sky, and it says like written on it, there's kind of like she longs to be one with the sky again, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Really beautiful painting. So that happens in this story. And but then it seems like she comes back down or something. She teaches people, and then she goes on to some, full enlightenment thing. And that's the last of the tales.
Hmm.
So I was reading all of them in the context of our episode, and I was thinking, yeah, in each of these, there's some like, and there's no exception to it.
Hmm.
There's not a one. They all have the same theme to it of some person who's sort of like in that thing, if you want to call it patriarchy or whatever you want to call it, each of these
Right.
characters are kind of in that, and then they just explode out of it in some burst, right?
Yeah.
Every single one of them. And I thought, okay, well, that might be like one of the deeper questions of, if you want to call it patriarchy, or whatever you want to call it, that every story ends with the heroine of the story like
Hmm.
popping out of their circumstances and transcending them in some ways, and then going forward to something like an enlightenment. Which, I mean, for me, that's kind of obviously one of the G&T themes, right? Ever since our very first episode, you have to write your own story. You
Right.
have to write your own myth for our first roomy thing we ever talked about. But it was really striking. I didn't know what they were going to be like, to be honest. I just went back, I had a conversation with someone, and I thought, well, I should go back and look at these.
Yeah.
Where can I find a source of the tales of how people handle this? And I went, okay, well, I'll look at this one,
Mm-hmm.
Masters of Mahamudra, or Legends of the Mahasiddhas in the Tibetan. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's it. And then when I was thinking about our episode, it's like, yeah, every character like explodes out of this patriarchy, right? And that's sort of what is part of their liberation story. And that
Yeah.
really struck me.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got something more on that one?
No, I mean, I just feel like this is reminiscent of our nine things that could fuck up your life, you know?
Mm,
That it's
yeah, yeah.
that, that there is an onus on the individual to break out of the structure that they have inherited, you know? And I think
Yeah.
in the context of what we were discussing at that time, it was your family. You know, it was your current kind of, I don't know, just
They
inherited
can,
circumstances, right? And
mhm.
those could be, you know, particularly familial and how again your intermediate family is working, but it could also be extrapolated into societal in looking at how uh, the expectations are set before you are born that you are to conform, you know, and that there is almost a requirement, I can say, and almost in every one of these stories, male, female in this case, but then male in other cases.
Yeah, I was getting to that too. So I want to jump on your thought, but it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Hmm.
like it's all, I mean, I don't know about every single story, but even the stories of householders, even the stories of regular people who attain enlightenment or attain these kind of states, they are forced to tackle or to grapple, depending on, you know, what kind of sports you like, with this facet of existence, and that the onus is on them to transcend those kind of that invisible hierarchy, whether you want to call it a patriarchy or whatever, but an invisible hierarchy that exists in society as we live in it, even way back when, right?
I,
Because it did exist then.
I think like the thing that struck me about it was like when you get to patriarchy, then if we want to use that phrase, right?
Sure.
Like Dr. Anita does, what you start to realize, and this was true even when I was listening to the interview, Daniel Odier, the guy who wrote this Tantric Quest book, was doing, it kind of traps everybody. It's not
Yeah.
just something that traps women, it traps kind of
Yeah.
everybody
Yeah.
potentially, And so we can call it patriarchy or we could call it something else, uh, but some kind of whatever higher, you kind of gave the phrase a few episodes ago,
No, you took it. You're taking it from my brain. Yes.
yeah, the religions were the first corporations or something,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he just, well, as far as this Daniel Odier guy, he just basically says all these women, all these religions really don't like women. They really don't like women. So he says that just as a flat principle. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm down with that. But you can also then say it's kind of something that can trap any spiritual seeking person,
Correct.
right? And I was going through it. I thought, well, it's the same story for like the Buddha. He has to like pop out of something,
Yeah.
right? He has to make this move away from whatever you want to call this thing, whatever word we want to put on it, and it's something that you could see it beyond just, you know, men or women or any other, person we might think of. There's something where this is a thing.
How many? I mean, you know, the question then is how many men died during the Salem witch trials?
Well, yeah. But you could also go, we were talking about this earlier, and I don't want to make equivalencies, but we were having these conversations. You get a bunch of dudes who say, hey, go fight those guys over there
Right.
and run into those guns, you
Right.
know?
So I guess,
So, it's
yeah,
human suffering all over the place,
yeah.
and that's the Buddhist thing of it,
I
right?
guess I was saying more in relation to like, um, spiritual growth as a threat to the status quo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. I get what you're saying.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
it seems like women might be the ones who might be the drivers of some of that, you know,
yeah.
and therefore the squelching of those,
Well, that definitely goes down
you
with,
know.
I mean, we were having a different conversation almost. You were talking not about like suffering overall, but the squelching down
Yeah, that
of
yeah, yeah.
the of women who want to engage in spirituality. We're going to
Yes.
crush them.
We're gonna crush them.
That's a thing for sure.
Right.
That's a thing for
That's
sure.
what, and that's what I'm saying
Yeah,
here.
that's absolutely a thing for sure.
That's what
Yeah.
I'm saying here.
And that's like kind of like, again, Tantric Quest guy. Like that's
Yeah.
the point he's making too. You try to be a woman, you try to do that. Well, There's going to be forces that are kind of going to try to smush you down, which I guess makes this tradition really interesting because it is female voices then. I mean, there's at least 4 stories there
Out of
of
80,
women doing
4.
extraordinary things. Out of 80, that's subpar. But it's actually a little bit misleading because there are a lot of female characters who appear in the lives of these male
Sure,
figures.
sure.
So, but yeah, at least there's something,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah, and it's really interesting. Like I can kind of just quote it real quick because I knew there was a passage in here relevant to this. Again, I'm using Daniel Odier's book Tantric Quest, and he gets his initiation from his teacher, Debbie, this female tantrika, and she says to him, like kind of like it's like one of the climactic points of the whole book, right? Not the full sexual climax book, that's a different part of the book, but maybe in the glowing aftermath, you know. But she says to him, initiation, so you enter in the spiritual path, right? Your initiation also involves a rupture with the myths of the specific society in which you live, establishing a profound and unconditional tie with all human beings. There's your interdependence, your non-separableness that you were talking about even earlier, before we went on Mike, Daniel, right? Feeling that connection with people. But okay, and with all this been previously seemed inanimate to you, so almost the Taoist or shamanistic or Buddhist feeling of like all the world is now alive somehow and I'm connected to it, right? And then initiation releases you from taboos and social, dietary, and sexual prohibitions. And more importantly, the prohibitions linked to ideas and thought. I thought that was really well said too. It's not just like how you're looking at the world around you, but the things that are actually in your mind that you have to release, right? Or get released. You cut the head off. Well done, Daniel. Thank you. Yeah. Um, and it says it's a liberation with regard to dogma, because we all know religions were the first corporations. To belief, to doubt. It's liberation with regard to dogma, to belief, to doubt, and to theory. The Tantric plunges themselves into reality with the whole body mind. They don't skim, they experiment. I like that part too, right? They live the teaching, and by living, they continue the flow of Tantra. That's the meaning of the word Tantra. Continuation of the Tantric experience through the Tantrika, a chain of women and men who risk the real and are no longer subject to the compromises social beings submit to. There's the patriarchy question, right? So, anyways, cool. Yeah. So I just wanted to get to like that part of patriarchy too, that part that like kind of applies to everyone, right? And like, again, not to deny the parts that are, as you were so sagely pointing out, you're a Salem witch. Guess again, we got a solution for you.
Yeah, we got it.
Let's see if you float.
Right.
There's our solution for you, right? But the thing that like kind of like bounds all kinds of people together, all kinds of people, and holds them down, and the theme seems to be there. So anyways, I thought I would share the tales of our Mahamudra ladies. And I was really struck by, oh yeah, it's the same story for these ladies too.
Yeah.
And so at some point or another, they're going to have to pop out. And then, they do. And then they're the heroines of the stories, right? So a little G&T story time for us, a little Joseph Campbell flashback. But yeah, okay, cool. Stuff to think about for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, these things go where they go. So, that's how it's Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, as always, thank you much, my friend.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you to our audience for tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe, share our work, do your thing. We're sponsored by ourselves. And so, we appreciate the love. Hit us up, ginandtantra@gmail.com, the Gin and Tantra podcast, or, leave us a comment in the YouTube section. We'll get back to you at our earliest convenience, which is, sometime soon and sometimes not, but we will for sure. We appreciate everybody tuning in and, the engagement with this in your own life. So, at any time you have any like questions or comments or something like this, something that strikes you funny or fancy, please reach out. We're legitimately interested in the kind of communal piece to this, because we're presenting these ideas, but as we present them, we're learning them and engaging with them in ourselves, and it's nice to hear how other people are learning from this in their own life, or other things or resources that they might have, or things you might want us to cover in general. So we're always looking to grow. So hit us up. And we'll take you all from there. So for Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.